All right, so we have a new episode of Legends and Leaders, and it's great to have Ben here, who's the CEO of Harmless Harvest, somebody who's had so much experience in the food industry and really trying to push out sustainable and ethical practices in the industry, all the way from creating the product to packaging the product. It's really great to have you here. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it, Ben.
Awesome. So I love to just start like early life. Where did this passion, come from for wanting to create really just sustainable and good for the environment products?
Yeah, I mean, it stems from a few things. So, first of all, I'll just start. I am a first generation college student. I grew up in rural Wisconsin. Both my parents grew up on farms. That's where I started my early life. So, my parents got married when they were extremely young. I was not a planned pregnancy. And so they got married and bought a trailer and parked it next to my grandparents' barn. And that's where we lived.
Wow.
So I spent lots of time, in the fields, helping pick stones, riding my tricycle through the barn. Occasionally had a couple mishaps and fell into the gutter. Didn't really enjoy that. I still, when you think of early memories, cow manure was definitely one of them. Did not like that aspect. But yeah, was very close to that. Our family had massive gardens and would grow their own, our own produce. So, whether it's picking raspberries and blueberries and strawberries to, I mean, more potatoes than you could ever imagine. That was certainly good gut fill for the family. But yes, so it was very close to the land and food. Growing up, we lived in that trailer for a little while. That marriage didn't work out, so my parents got a divorce, and then I lived with my grandparents, just back and forth on the farms. And then eventually, my mom got married again, and we bought an old farmhouse, also out in the country. And um, we didn't have very much, and so I had a lot of chores early, and one of the chores I had to do was I had to cook for the family. So I'd get home, I'm in
Huh.
elementary school, and there'd be a recipe. So beyond the gardening and all that type of stuff, and whether it be canning, yeah, stuff, making jams, jellies, I mean, you name it. I also had to cook. So, meatloaf, right? I'd have like the different types of meat. I'd have to cut some bread, make some breadcrumbs, mix in the egg, whatever. And like each day was a different recipe. So I became very comfortable in the kitchen, comfortable kind of gardening and in the fields and whatever it may be. And so I've always had this, and my family, they were good cooks, right? There's one thing,
Mhm.
I never went without food. We went without a lot of other things, but certainly not food. And lots of family celebrations, lots of cooking. And I learned at a young age. I'm not a like I'm a hack. I can make. I mean, people will say, like my wife will say, "There's nothing to eat in the refrigerator," whatever. I'm like, "Oh, they're like literally seven different meals I can make." I mean, they're like just I'm very much a hack in the kitchen, and very comfortable kind of like making something and putting something together. Someday I'll learn how to really cook and get, more refined and kind of like skilled. I'm always envious of people who can take like four simple ingredients and make something amazing. Meanwhile, I've like hacked 17 different things to like make it taste good. Um, so that combination of the farming and that kind of environment, good cooking, learning, and getting comfortable in the kitchen, certainly I think was a good foundation. I love that in what I do, everybody has to eat and drink, and so everybody can have a point of view on it, and I think that's really rewarding versus if I were to do tech or something like that, like not everybody can identify with the types of products that you're making. So I think that's kind of fun and it's competitive. It's hard. I mean, it's a really hard industry to make successful. I'd say the final thing that really I think for me made it very personal is my families grew up they did conventional farming. So lots of
Mm.
chemicals and things like that. And when I look around to my family members, there's a fair amount of cancer, a fair amount of Parkinson's.
Really?
My father had multi-system atrophy, which is basically the cerebellum.
Mhm.
It's a degenerative disease, and it just basically its cerebellum just dies over time, and it's terminal. So my dad has passed. He passed 6 years ago now, and it is one of my, actually, ironically, a good friend that I live next to in Minneapolis. He is a PhD. He's a professor at the University of Minnesota there, and he specializes in this area. And the first question he asked me was, "Did your dad grow up on a farm?" That, yeah, a conventional farm? And I said yes. And he said there's
Huh.
a high correlation with the types of chemicals and things that are common on farms with multi-system atrophy, Parkinson's, like these types of diseases. And so, for me, it's also then personal of like, organic and regenerative organic, and how do we do things better? That only strengthened kind of my commitment and my desire to live that way.
Yeah. So, I mean, you had a lot of experience and even a personal experience really around like the food area specifically, but what about like the business area? Like how did the business side of things come together?
Well, what's so I at a young age, had to mow lawns and do stuff like that. That's how I paid for my own clothes and paid for college and stuff like that. My first job was actually at a private golf and country club, which was probably a perfect job for me, in the sense that it became very obvious to me that, I can do something besides work at a factory.
Mhm.
And, if you go get your education, you can be a business person, a doctor, a lawyer, and whatnot. And that's where I got very kind of enamored by that, about the idea of going to school. I applied and went to Madison. And I quickly settled on business. I did, while I was at the Golf and Country Club, I did just about everything there. I've cooked, I've done dishes, I've
Yeah.
done a little bit of everything. But um, I have this, part of this growing up with very little, like I have this, it developed in me this ability to, I always see possibility. I'm a very glass half full kind of person. And, and I just generally think everything's possible. And that I mean, there's a shadow side to that. You could talk to my team, anybody I work with, right? There's certainly a shadow side to that. But I do feel like, if there's a will, there is a way, and
Mhm.
and that serves well in business, on that tenacity and the pushing and driving and maximizing. And through my jobs, like I found, they, at one point they wanted me to run that like activity bar and grill for the golf course and whatnot. And, they just wanted me to take a straight salary. And I was like, no, I'll take a lower salary, but I want a percent of sales.
Mm.
And then opened up cart service out on the golf course, pool service. Like I mean, I really, drove the business, and that was like an early, if I think back, and I haven't really, thought about it that much, but when I think back, that definitely, was kind of my first experience on kind of entrepreneurial, and how do you kind of drive and maximize sales and whatnot. So that was a great experience, and I drove a lot of sales. So I think that definitely ruffled some feathers of other folks in the club, because I definitely got lucky and negotiated a pretty good deal there. It was just a summer. I wish I could have made it a little bit longer, but um, yeah. So I've always had kind of like in college I had all sorts of waiting tables, bartending. I sold spring break trips, because if you sell 15, you get to go for free. So I would sell 15 and then no more. But yeah, I always had kind of uh, the business started to come natural for me, just kind of who I was and how I operated.
Right. And so you at one point you took like a I believe a trip to Costa Rica and you kind of got like a more like a volunteer trip, more hands-on experience. Did you feel like you kind of had you mentioned you had a lot of experience already when in just various different in the food area in a sense, by living basically with this farm, and then you kind of had some business experience and you wanted to go the business route. Why did you kind of just say, hey, I'm just going to go to I'm going to volunteer over here and not focus on anything business and kind of go back to my origins in a sense. Well, what was the purpose of that?
Yeah, so my wife and I have this kind of thing we do periodically, where we sit down and we might be out to dinner, like, hey, let's just, what do you want to do over the next couple of years? And we, grab a napkin and a pen and whatever. So we write down some things and then we share it back and forth. And this was, pre-kids. And, in that we both wanted to go do some volunteer work. And we wanted to go learn Spanish. I speak German because I lived in Germany and studied in Germany for a little while. But I didn't speak any Spanish. I'm like, oh, that would be great. Like it was actually something I wanted to do. And so we decided and we did some research and found an organization, and we lived separately actually in the beginning with families. So we would learn Spanish faster. And then after several weeks, we then moved in together, and then we lived on this organic coffee farm. It did all sorts of jobs, and it was this farm set up for landless farmers. So it was kind of a co-op, and their cash crop was coffee. So we did a little bit of a reforestation, kind of a windbreak for the coffee, and then they had farms, where they were growing, produce to, sell a bit, kind of more farmer stand kind of stuff, as well as like to feed the families. So we did all sorts, whatever they needed us to do is what we did. And it was, again, getting back to like, where does our food come from? How do different, when you think about it in different societies, like, food is just such a central thing. And it's a great demonstration of love and respect to one another. And so it's such a central thing. And we thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah. So you had various different corporate jobs, in the food area, and then you went on to do something kind of different, focusing on baby products and baby food. Why did you want to go to that angle? And what were some of like the skills that you took from your previous work and applied to this company when you were at it?
Yeah. So I worked at General Mills for, I think it was 8 years. Yeah, 8 years. Had really a fantastic experience. Learned so much. I mean, really learned how to run a business and how to think about it holistically, both from demand generation, whether it be marketing or innovation or, kind of your base business, and the sales aspect of it, to the supply chain and R&D and whatnot, and just absolutely loved it. And what's interesting is when I was there, one of my passions, and I think something I was really known for was, I am at the end of the day a foodie, and I'm also a person who believes in just driving as much health and wellness as you can. And,
Mhm.
make no mistake, I get it. Product like Hamburger Helper or Progresso or whatever brands they are, they may not be organic and they may not be, like the perfect, but if you can reduce sodium, if you can pull out
Mhm.
MSG, if you can get more vegetables in, if you can remove, from different products like artificial colors and flavors, those products are bought by, let's just make it up, 20, 30, 40% of households per year. You're reaching lots of people. But if you're
Mhm.
pulling some sodium out, you're pulling out artificial colors, you're pulling out artificial flavors, you're making each bite better, right? That is having a positive impact. When I went to Plum Organics, it was now going to the other side of it. How do you take something that is very small, but inherently really good, so organic, nutritious,
Mhm.
and how do you get that from, 1% of households to 15% of households? How do you start reaching more people with something that's nearly great versus one that's already getting into almost, into a lot of households? And how do you make that better while still appealing to their sense of taste, not changing costs very much, still delivering sales and profit that the company needs? That's a great challenge. I love those types of things. Like, okay,
Yeah.
I still have to deliver sales. I still have to deliver profit. People still have to love the product. How do I make it taste better, which usually requires more expensive ingredients? So how do I offset that in other ways? So that's a great challenge. Now, how do you scale something that's inherently healthy and nutritious? And the thing that was really surprising, that is just so important to know, is when you have a baby. So during pregnancy, even pre-pregnancy, obviously, I mean, there's like so much science. We go down a rabbit hole, but we're not going to do that. You're building a person, and so what you eat and what you drink is very germane to the health and wellness of that little one. So, what you're eating and drinking, and then what you then ultimately are feeding them in those first few days and stuff like that, that is so important. You're not only building a person, but then you're teaching them health habits, right? It's just you're trying to build out that palate. You want them to be eating a wide range of things. And that's a really important moment. And it's also, when you think about it from a consumer standpoint, there are inflection points in your life where you kind of like change behaviors or whatever. And having a child is one of those moments where parents kind of like take stock on like, what do I need to feed? What do we need to do? And that's when they typically transition to organic as a
Mm,
household.
interesting.
They think differently about how they clean their house. Are they using Raid for bugs or whatever, or are they finding a more, using spearmint or something like that to like, keep, you just change how you operate. And that is for me a really exciting opportunity to help. How do you change, improve a whole generation of young little ones, parents as they're raising them, like helping them build a better palate. You're building a human being, you know what I mean? So like, what you put in, directly impacts, overall health and wellness.
And when you're building like a healthier product, like you mentioned, you said there's certain trade-offs. You want to be able to have a competitive price and then maybe take some things out, but still have an overall better product. You did that with Plum. You're doing that here with Harmless Harvest. How do you determine what you can take out, and what you should keep in? And then in terms of price point, like how do you think about what type of price point you can put the product as that actually competes with products that maybe aren't as healthy, but people are buying much more because they're more affordable?
It's not easy, right? And so I generally I like to prioritize making the stuff you consume as amazing as possible. And then I'm always looking for like how can we be absolutely as efficient on all the rest, right? And from a processing standpoint, how gentle can we be? Like how, because the more heat, the more things you do to a product, you're killing nutrients. It's no longer fresh. So it changes things. Now, some nutrients, like let's say a tomato, is healthier. There's certain things when you cook it, it actually the availability of nutrients and stuff like that are more digestible and whatnot. So it's not a I think sometimes we always think fresh is better, and generally fresh is I prefer fresh, but there are some things that when you cook it, it actually becomes better. Um, so it is. I am not afraid to have a premium price product as long as your product obviously is delivering on that. But you also have to make sure you're not pricing yourself out of the market such that nobody can really afford it. And at the end of the day, in everything I do, I really want to democratize it as much as possible. Like I want it to
Yeah.
be attainable for as many people as possible. So I really challenge us to think about like how we streamline the rest. I do have a philosophy that to me developing a successful item that consumers are going to buy and repeatedly buy is far more difficult because there's so much innovation that fails, right? It's really hard because you know consumer taste and all that. Like you can't test all the variables. There are just thousands of variables that determine whether something's going to work or not. That's really difficult. Making money on a product, once you know something's working in the marketplace, then cost optimizing, whether it be okay, now we're gonna we're hand packing the product into cases. Well, look, we can automate that. We can put in machine, we can put in capital to automate that. And so making money on a product, I always say, is that's far easier, right? Because it's like, oh, if I just eliminate the labor here and deploy the labor in other places that we need where we're hiring and whatnot, and then put a machine in, or if I take decrease the thickness of the corrugate, or I whatever. Those are very understandable inputs that yield a very predictable outcome. So that's easy from a decision making and solving. It may take time and it may take capital. Um, Figuring out like what consumers are really going to buy and what is the right quality and the right price point and the taste. Is it you're as you do stuff with a little less sugar because you're trying to wean people from lots of sugar. Did you go too low and now consumers don't want it? There's all these little things that are just really hard to predict, and which is why you just have to think. I think for those that are innovating, like you got to iterate. You got to be willing to just keep tweaking until you get it right, and you got to do that rapidly.
Mhm. Yeah. So once you essentially took over as CEO of Harmless Harvest, they were really focused on coconut water, right? And now there's been this whole like expansion into plant-based foods and yogurt and all these other different interesting categories. Why did you want to steer it in that direction when the product seemed to be doing well? And then also, how are some of the ways that you've kind of thought about creating these new product categories? Have you just identified other categories that are easier to get into that are similar to the product you're currently creating, and then said, hey, this can make sense because it's lower cost? Like, what were some of the ways you thought about that?
Yeah, the first observation for me when I joined the company was we make an amazing coconut water, and it is very successful. But
Hmm.
99.8% of our sales are coming from three or four sizes of coconut water, and that's great. But like ultimately, I felt that we were going to need to start building some shoulders to this business, whether it be
Hmm.
different kind of pack sizes and multi packs and things like that. That of course, but an important observation that I just felt was not harmless was we were buying 40 million coconuts and taking 40 million coconuts to the landfill. And we weren't scooping the meat out of there. We weren't doing anything. We buy the most expensive coconut that you can buy. And we take the water out, and then we were paying to take these coconuts to the landfill, and then paying to deposit them in the landfill, which for an unprofitable company is not financially smart. And when your name is Harmless Harvest and you're mission driven, like this is not, harmless at all. And so, the first mandate was we got to get to zero waste. We have, so supply chain innovation, we have to use this entire coconut. Thankfully, we're pretty good at, developing food and beverages. So like the meat has been easier to use. The husk is tougher for us because we harvest it young. It's very moist and wet. So we use it for compost. It works well for that. There's some fiber. There's things like that. We've had some hits and misses along the way on using the husk, but we're getting close to using 100% of the husk. So good progress there, but that one's harder for us. From a meat standpoint, it's because we harvest the coconut so young. It is the meat is very thin and kind of gelatinous. So if you puree it, it's really smooth and creamy. And so it lends itself to smoothies and plant-based dairy. And so first of all, we had to start, doing a lot of things with it. So that generates ideas on beverage. As we think about plant-based dairy and our entry into plant-based dairy, it's make setting, like entering a new category and succeeding in a new category is very difficult, right? And a lot of, I'm sure founders and CEOs and other leaders or whatever, people who do innovation, like, you have a right to innovate around your core business, right?
Hmm.
So, we do, the coconut water, and then we do a smoothie, and then we do coconut water with pulp, we do whatever, like easier to succeed there because your consumers are already coming there and you're building out new occasions, potentially attracting some new consumers that are in the category. You now start to get a better presence on shelf. Easier path. The tougher path is entering a whole new category and making sure that you have a really good point of difference. And that was for me what, the two things that ultimately made me decide to enter into yogurt were one, we had all this coconut meat that we wanted to use. And it definitely, it's for us, a reasonably inexpensive raw material because we already have it. We've already bought the coconut. And B, we could make yogurt differently than anybody else does. And
Yeah.
one of the basic rules in any product you're developing is like you need to be addressing a consumer need, and you have to have a point of differentiation. And we feel like we mimic dairy-based yogurt the best, right? We're able to have a nice creamy. It's not because it's a young coconut. It hasn't developed those really strong kind of coconut flavor, so it doesn't have a strong coconut flavor and just a really good dairy execution that is differentiated. And we ultimately felt that we made the best plant-based yogurt and the best coconut-based for sure. And so that's what we ultimately decided is to launch that. But yeah, so it's been a lot of development of just it's matching like what are consumer needs, where are there opportunities to disrupt in the marketplace, how do we bring something different and use coconut meat.
Right. It's a lot that goes into it, and I think it's smart to be efficient about, you have this resource. You're already paying for this resource. Might as well use the most of it you can. It's good logic. Yeah.
And I have this, and it's just on some level, it's an illness I have in the sense that I hate waste. I am like all like I growing up, nothing got thrown away. I mean, I used to go every Saturday to the dump. We'd take our garbage, and then I'd find treasures. My first bike came from the dump. Like, I don't know. It's just this like I don't like waste, and so for when you're developing products and like you have this coconut material, like how do we use it, right? How do we make sure that we use it? And so for me it's just also just kind of in my DNA to use every if you're going to buy something or whatever, grow something, you got to use it all up in a responsible way.
Right. Yeah. Makes sense. And it's good, definitely good practice to have, especially like you said, the name Harmless Harvest. Like you got to be able to
Mm.
embrace that,
Yep.
of course. So so you basically you've expanded to a couple different product categories. Do you think there's something like are there certain categories that maybe are not like as close to the original one, but that are a little bit further away that you're now looking at expanding into? Like, what are some of the future ideas in terms of product categories you think you want to go into?
Yeah, I think about it two different ways right now. Certainly, there are other places we can take our coconut meat and coconut water. And so, we are playing around with some various formulations and things like that that would take us into different categories. Again, it's going to go back to that lens of like, is there an unmet need or, or something that can be disrupted? So, as we did in smoothies, these smoothies that you can buy have 50 grams of sugar and they're made with like juice concentrates and whatnot, which, if you make a smoothie at home, I don't know how many people actually start with putting juice concentrate in the blender before
Yeah.
they put other stuff in. Like that doesn't make sense. Whereas
Yeah.
people do make smoothies with coconut water, right? So we're just doing coconut water with the coconut meat, which you get the fiber and the MCTs, and then you add the fruits and vegetables and everything like that. So it's no added sugar. So it was for us, we're like, we end up with far less sugar and it's no added sugar and it's hydrating because it's got the electrolytes from and potassium from the coconuts. And it's mimics more of how a person makes a smoothie. So there's always that lens of like, can we bring a benefit that's really needed from a consumer standpoint? So we certainly look at it that way. The other lens, quite honestly, that I've had the team looking at is we've been exploring what other crops, when you think about crops, have issues from an agricultural standpoint, whether they're a lot of it is using pesticides and things like that. But there are definitely some environmental things where we can take kind of the experience and what we're passionate about from a farming standpoint, as we transition to regenerative organic farming practices, can we bring that to bear on some crop that really would benefit? Combined with we're fair for life and we work with the local community. We set aside dollars for every single coconut that we buy.
Mm.
And they have a local board, the farmers, whatever, and they decide how they're going to spend those dollars in their community. So on school projects, health and wellness checkups, clean water, you name it. Are there then, in addition to kind of the agricultural element, are there labor abuses or are there labor challenges in certain agricultural items? And then the final lens, which is where it's like, is there something, is there an innovation opportunity, right? Are there unmet consumer needs, or could you better meet a consumer's need with either a better quality, lower sugar, lower something, whatever it may be. So, we have some ideas and some things that we've been tinkering around there as well. And so, I think you can look at, and that, goes outside of coconut clearly, but it is Harmless Harvest, right? It is who we are as a brand. So, we do look at how do we, it's either, it's obviously continuing to use as, the entire coconut that we're doing, but then beyond coconut, is there, how do we bring harmless to another category?
Hmm. Yeah. So the drink itself has this like pinkish looking color, and it's
Yeah.
because right there aren't these other other unnatural things put into it, etc. Do you think that that's helped the drink gain more, the coconut water gain more traction overall? Do you think it's been a positive on sales?
Yeah, I actually, I do think it is a positive. It wasn't. So I don't think originally it was much of a positive, and I think I still have consumers like, oh, what flavor is it, or what have you
Right.
added, or what have you done? Like coconut water is not pink, and you're right. When it first comes out, it's not pink. But I think what's interesting when you explain and you understand, like most coconut waters. Well, first of all, the difference between our coconut water and any other coconut water, typically what other coconut waters are doing, they're just buying whatever spec of coconut water that they're looking for, a certain pH and bricks, and it's on the global market, and it's just a blend of like, cheap coconut water, often from mature coconuts, which we believe don't taste as good. Whereas we only use this Nam Hom coconut out of Thailand, and it's harvested young. So we think you start with like what is the best quality, and then where most coconut waters, what they're doing is they're using an ultra high temperature, so they're cooking it at really high temperatures. So you're basically kind of killing everything. That's how they sterilize. That's how they make the product safe.
Mm.
Whereas we don't do a thermal process. We just go through, a proprietary filtration process. So the product has not been heated up to high temperatures. And so it's still alive. Like the enzymes and polyphenols, so the antioxidants are alive and they can start interacting. So, it's kind of similar. Like if you cut an apple and you leave it on the counter, it starts to turn brown.
Right.
And ours over time with the light and the oxygen, whatever, it turns pink. So it's alive, it's interacting. It's just the polyphenols and enzymes because we haven't cooked it at an ultra high temperature. It's alive, and so it starts turning pink. And so pink is certainly a little easier than brown to market.
Right.
So, no offense to the soda manufacturers, but certainly pink is it's a beautiful color, and so I do think it has ultimately helped. Yes.
Yeah. I think just the last question I have here. In terms of your career, you've done so many different things throughout and been in various roles. What do you hope to achieve, within the next, let's say, 10 years or so and beyond in your career?
Yeah. So I love the space that I operate in. I'm really enjoying my time, but I love, so often people say, oh, you should go to bigger companies. And, there are certain situations where that may make sense, but I like taking something small and really scaling it. Like, how do
Yeah.
you really make it a durable, sustainable, viable business?
Oh,
Like
it's
when
fun.
I when I took over Harmless Harvest, it was wildly unprofitable, and not, there were a lot of challenges with business, but I had a great product, and it does start with a great product.
Mm.
And those are things you can fix. And now, we've nearly doubled margins. Like the company's profitable. It's we're in much better shape, but it takes maniacal discipline of like continuous improvement. How do you streamline? How do you get all the inefficiencies out of the system? And I have an amazing team, so we've had good success at that. And for me, I want to like spend time with entrepreneurs and other, small companies and mentor. I want to help. I want to help grow this whole new generation of businesses. Our food system is overly reliant on a few, few big multinational companies. B, very few raw material inputs that are and what we need as a just overall health is a lot more variety and less processing, simpler, fresher as much as we can, because the environmental impacts of what we're doing just as a global community, especially in food and beverage, like there's so much we need to improve from a health and wellness standpoint as well as from an environmental standpoint. So that's where I want to have impact. I want to keep ushering, growing these new generation of businesses and how we operate, right? Leaving the land better than when we started. Like, how do you get back to greater biodiversity and regenerative farming? How do you make sure that you are working responsibly in your communities such that these are viable, good paying jobs? I mean, part of our goals for regenerative organic is not only just to transition to regenerative, but like we have stated goals on at least 10% increase in their in farmer incomes, right? So how do we make sure that they're getting better yields? And what we're finding is that the nitrogen fixing cover crops and stuff like that are causing less erosion, so they have to dredge not as often. They don't have to pay for weeding and whatnot. So it's actually lowering their costs. So just how do you find more and more wins? Because it only works when both parties win.
Yeah. Well, Ben, look, I appreciate you coming on and sharing just so much of the wisdom that you've learned throughout your career, and just some of the insights into what you've been building. I think you guys have a great mission, and something that really needs to be much more widespread. And the work you're doing now here with Harmless Harvest is just, I think, going to help so many people be able to get much healthier products and eventually cut the costs on some of these products so they are more mass marketed, which would be the goal. So definitely commend the work you're doing, and I wish you much success going forward.
Thanks a lot, Ben.